Leaving line stream. Okay, we want to welcome everyone to this edition of Mountaineer Farm Talk, May 10th, 2024. My name is JJ Barrett, and I am the Extension Agent for Agriculture and Natural Resources right here in Wood County, West Virginia. For WVU Extension, I've got my co-host with me. I've got Evan Wilson. He is down in Mason County. Evan, how are you today?
Doing good, JJ. Nice, cool, brisk morning here in Mason County. A little chillier than I thought it was going to be today. But after this is over, we're going to go work on building a high tunnel up at Wahama High School with the ag program up there. Then we got our round 2 of tag day tomorrow morning for our fair animals.
Round 2. What was round 1?
Round 1, we tag our hogs, lambs, heifers, feeders, and goats 2 different weekends at 2 different locations
Well, why do you do that? We just do one shot.
because we have close to 400 head.
Okay.
And we try to do both ends of the county. We do one at Ashton Elementary, which is southern end, and then one at the fairgrounds.
Well, we don't have quite that many. We have quite a few feeder calves. Also, my other guest, of course, my colleague Brandy Brabham. She is down in Roane County. Brandy, how are you this morning?
Doing good, JJ. Like Evan said, it's a little chillier this morning, but I can get used to the cooler weather, not cold.
Yeah, the summer hit us with a haymaker there.
Yes,
First couple weeks of May, but it's rained quite a bit. I want to welcome our special guest for today, Dr. Theresa Culley. She is professor at the University of Cincinnati, plant ecologist or biologist. Theresa, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. This is great.
What is your title there?
Oh, my title is I'm a professor of plant biology at the University of Cincinnati.
Plant biology. All right. Well, that's right up our alley. Horticulture. We do a lot of. You work any with what county are you in? Hamilton?
So I actually work in Hamilton, but I'm from Butler, just north.
Oh, okay.
In southwestern
Cool.
Ohio. Yep.
You don't ever work with Joe Boggs down there, do you?
Oh, of course. In fact, I'm working with him now on a whole box tree moth thing going on with boxwood. That's a whole maybe a different conversation.
He's quite the he's the bug guy.
He's fun.
Buggy Joe Boggs. Yeah, but today we're going to be talking about the Callery pear, this invasive species that was brought over here. Of course, that bloom time has came and went, but I guess first, Theresa, what give us a little bit about your background, how you ended up at the University of Cincinnati working in biology and horticulture.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm actually originally from Southern California and grew up there. And my dad is actually from Ohio. I have in-laws from Iowa working on the farms there. And how did I get here? I got here because I went to Ohio State for graduate work to work with Dr. Allison Snow, and I just love it. So I wanted to come back to the Midwest. And so that's what I did. And I got a job. And I just got interested in horticulture, I guess. I always used to garden. I still garden today. It's one of my hobbies, things that I love to do. I love to get outdoors. And so I have a job now where fortunately I can combine being an academic professor and writing papers and all that with actually working with people like yourselves and going outside and planting in my garden. And so, yeah, that's what I do.
And what work did you do at? You said Ohio State. What was your graduate work? What were you studying?
Yeah, I was actually studying violets, like little violets that you can have in your lawn, like Viola Soria, the purple violet. And I like science to me is really cool because you can explore weird things. And so violets, a lot of people may or may not know, they actually produce 2 types of flowers. So you have the big showy violet flower that everyone knows is a violet, but violets also produced a little tiny, it's like a bud. It's called the cleistogamous self-pollinated flower later on, and they just go directly to seed. So a lot of people don't know that it's a flower. And so I wanted to know, why would a plant do this strange thing? Why would it produce 2 types of flowers? And it turns out it's connected to the light levels. So in the early spring, before the trees leaf out, pollinators are zooming around and all the plants produce these showy flowers that are then visited by the bees and out cross-pollinated. And then once the forest canopy starts to form, the bees stop buzzing around so much in the forest, and the plants just suddenly switch over to the second type of flower production, these little buds. And so, yeah, that's what I wanted to do, is to find out why, the plants would bother to do this weird thing.
And what classes do you teach there at the University of Cincinnati?
I teach a number of classes. I love to teach. And so I oftentimes will teach like medical botany. I just finished teaching conservation biology. And another sort of unusual class that I teach is a class on dying well. And so that's with our honors program.
Dying well. Well, you have to tell us what that class is about.
It's about death and dying, but I don't want to be a downer.
Okay. Well, yeah, that
She's
well,
Reed
it's kind of
Street and not Debbie, so
a wide range of classes there that you teach. But let's talk about the calorie pear. I know that I think that especially in the last couple of years, and I'm actually Evan's background is the calorie pear there. Where's that at, Evan, in your background picture?
and so this is my cousin's farm. Just a few miles out the road from me where I've got my sheep, and my sheep are going to be part of the plan to keep it down.
Okay.
They planted a few pear trees probably 25, 30 years ago. And I mean like 5 or 6. He passed away 12 years ago. We tried to do hay on top for a few years, but it wasn't worth the hillside.
Mhm.
And this is what happens with pear trees 12 years without any management.
Yeah, and I think that, and I'm sure Theresa can expand on this, but over the last couple of years, especially in early spring, in our area in Parkersburg, along Route 50 and along the interstate, yeah, they're just and it seems like the number of these trees has just expanded exponentially in the last couple of years. You see all these white blooms, and people are like, "Oh, look at all the pretty white trees," but really, it's invasive that's taken over the landscape.
Right.
But
That's
where, Teresa, where did I read that article you wrote about the rise and
Yeah.
fall of the calorie pear? What it's really kind of a fascinating story where this tree came from.
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the things why it captured my interest, is because I told you I like weird, odd things. And so the question I had is, being a gardener and working with plants in my yard, I wanted to know why this plant that for years wasn't a problem at all, people planted all over the place in their yards, why would it suddenly within the last 15 to 20 years or so just take off? And sort of like Evan's background picture there, just spread all over like crazy. And so that's what we wanted to know. And so to back up, I can tell you that the pear, some of your listeners might not know this history. It's fascinating. So it was originally native to Asia. So it was introduced from China back in the early 1900s. So at that time in the US, there were big orchards of calorie, not the calorie pear, it's the common pear, Pyrus communis. And this is like the Bartlett pear, that we can buy in the store. And on the West Coast, there's these huge orchards, and they were being hit by fire blight. And so the trees were dying. So the USDA sent explorers over to China to try to collect seeds from a related species that might be fire blight resistant. And so that, of course, was the calorie pear. So they brought over they explain, kilograms, piles and piles of these seeds. They planted them on the West Coast of the US, on the East Coast of the US. And then they would test them for fire blight resistance to do traditional breeding with its relative Pyrus communis.
Teresa, they planted those at. I was reading the story, not to get ahead of you. They were at some of these USDA experiment stations, right? Experiment farms.
Exactly. And so one of the big ones was Glendale, Maryland.
All right.
And so at Glendale, they would plant these huge, numbers of seeds out there. And at Glendale, one of the seeds, germinated, became a tree. And one of the guys working there at the station saw it and thought, wow, that's a pretty attractive tree. It had a nice globular shape that looked good. A lot of the species in China, by the way, they have thorns. And technically they're called spurs. But this one didn't. And so he thought, wow, that looks like a really great tree someone would want to plant in their yard. And so he kept his eye on it for a while. And then he cloned it, essentially. They planted them out in Glendale, Maryland, in the neighborhood just to test them to see how they did. And the trees did great. They could survive all types of, if you don't water it very well, and It gets too cold, it could survive.
Take some
And
abuse.
people, yeah. And this
Plant,
wasn't,
plant and go.
yeah, this was 1961. So more people saw the trees, they wanted them, and it became really popular. And that is what is known today as the Bradford tree. And so the Bradford is essentially one clone, one genotype, we call it in my world, where if Evan has a Bradford in his yard and my neighbor has one in her yard, they're genetically the same thing. It's just a clone. And the species is self-incompatible. And this is a member of the rose family. So if you've ever grown a lot of apricots or plums or something like that, in many cases or blueberries is a great example. You might need to have a second type of cultivar in order to get fruit production.
Pollinate.
Yeah, to pollinate it. And so because everyone was just planting the Bradford, there were no fruits. So it was sterile. There was only the Bradford. It couldn't cross with anyone.
Emphasis on was, right?
It was. And
Was.
then after about 20 to 25 years or so, the trees, the Bradford specifically, it doesn't have a central leader. So if you ever look at them, the trunk goes up and then it branches out. And so what would happen is it just got so big, and if you didn't carefully prune it, it would essentially self-destruct. And so people who love their Bradfords are beautiful trees, all that spring blooms, although they smell disgusting, I think. But they wanted to replace it. And so that's when the plant breeders and growers developed a variety of different Callery pear cultivars, we call them. So the Bradford's one, then there was like the Aristocrat, which came from Kentucky. There was the Cleveland Select, the Chanticleer. Those are actually exactly the same thing. Yeah. And so people started to plant those out in their yard, and now all the trees can cross-pollinate because the insects just zoom all over the place. And so that's why now we're getting all these seeds. And then on top of that, birds, like starlings especially, will eat those seeds, fly off somewhere else, poop them out, and essentially plant them in a whole new location. And so that's why, for example, Evan has a huge mess in back of him.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what's fascinating about it, Theresa. So we're saying since 1960 or mid 60s, when the nursery companies really started pushing these trees, there's a lot of them out there, aren't there?
There are. And it was also, back in the 60s, we had no idea this would happen. We're learning as we go. And now, of course, 2020 hindsight, it's like, oh, we should have done things differently. So yeah, there's a lot of other cultivars out there now. There's over 50. And there's still more being developed in some areas, although that's starting now to be toned down because
they're still developing more.
Yeah, some are more cold
varieties.
Tolerant, which is a little scary to me. Because the cold tolerance is what limits their northward expansion.
Yeah, what I find so fascinating though too is this, of course, like Evan and Brain working with livestock, you've got that first hybrid cross, and I was reading that the trees in Asia had those little spurs on them, and then usually the trees like the Bradfords don't, but then this new wild cross, it's got some of those older characteristics, which makes it even nastier. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly true. So we call that, it's reverting back to its wild phenotype is like the academic way, but it's just, you're right. So what happens is the genes, the genetics for that, those thorns are still there. And so they start to appear when you get later generations. And so you get essentially a lot of thorny plants, and livestock are not going to be able to deal with those.
And they're nasty. They're about like grabbing a hold of a honey locust.
Exactly. That's a good comparison. I've actually pierced my palm grabbing one. And
oh yeah, it's easy. If you're not wearing good leather gloves, they're going to tear you apart.
Yeah, and what just from talking to a lot, of course, as extension agents, we get a lot of calls. I've gotten in the last month 2 or 3, and people ask, if it's a bigger tree, should they go ahead and cut it down? And I always what your opinion is, Teresa, but I always usually tell them to go ahead and take it down, and the faster that they can take it out and replace it with something else, the better than leaving it in the yard. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. If you do take it out, you got to be really careful about that. So you want to cut that down, right, towards the base. But it's really important that within about the first 10 minutes after you do that, you have to treat the stump. And what I mean by that is what we do. I oversee a nature preserve that our university owns in Cincinnati. And so oftentimes we have to go in and take out the pear. And so you cut them and then you spray a
Herbicide?
solution of usually 2% glyphosate Roundup. And we also put dye in the bottle. So then you could see when you spray it and someone's before you, they know that the stump's been treated. But if you don't do that, if you just cut it and walk away, these trees are good. So they're going to root sprout. So you're going to get a whole bunch of roots of sprouts coming up from that base. And essentially then instead of a single tree, you're going to get a big bush.
Yeah, like Evan said, it's kind of like a locust or wild cherry. Like I know a lot of farmers will cut those out in their fence line, and I try to preach the same gospel that I recommend a product called Tordon RTU. It's a broadly, it's for a cut stump treatment, and it's got the blue dye already in it, and you can tell where you've sprayed.
Yeah.
And I know that I maybe explain a little bit, and I tell them too. I say within 24 hours to spray that stump, but you're saying to spray it as soon as possible before it starts to put some.
It heals over and it doesn't allow it to penetrate through it.
Yeah, so the sooner the better, I guess.
Yeah, because once you cut it, you're going to have the xylem and the phloem exposed, and so you want to spray it so then the plant will actually draw that chemical down into its root system for you.
Yeah. And I'll have to check with Teresa the glyphosate or the Roundup. Do you recommend you only put a 2% solution on that stump and it'll kill them?
Yeah, that's what we do, and you can test it out, but that's been pretty effective for us.
Well, I was a gentleman called me and I was looking at what herbicides you can use, and I think the Penn State extension fact sheet said like 50%, but I'd have to check on that with the manufacturers.
And I think that's where people get in trouble. You just get in the groove of cutting down trees, and before long you realize you're an hour into it, and it's healed over.
Right.
But it might be too thick to even carry a sprayer through, like some places are. But we did have a comment here in the chats here right before we got started from Roger Shrout. He planted Bradford pears along I-79 winning college in the 70s between Morgantown and Clarksburg. So Roger, we'll call them Shrout pears up through there then.
Oh no.
No.
Yeah, they're just dying off. They're multiplying, and I've been watching the really old ones.
Okay.
That's over 50 years ago. That's right after, it was in the 1970. And that's right after you're saying they were really introduced from Maryland or whatever. And some of the older ones are still there, but with many, many new sprouts everywhere around them.
Oh. Yeah, and is that one of the even if you don't cut them down, besides the seeds, can they also sprout up from the root system, Teresa?
They can. Usually they won't on their own, but I have seen it like in residential areas where people, if they're mowing around a pear tree, if the roots are along the root surface and they nick it, then it will start to sprout. And so sometimes people will do that. Also, all the trees that you buy, they're grafted, right? So the top part of the tree, like a Bradford, they're all cloned, I told you. And then they're all grafted onto a root stock. And so sometimes at that graft point, you also get little sprouts coming. And some tree, you just have to keep cutting them. And if you don't, they're going to keep coming up. And then the problem there is that even if you have one tree and you've done your duty and you've said, okay, I'm just going to have a Bradford, there's no one around me, in miles who has a tree. you could still have a problem if your root stock, which is genetically different, sprouts and flowers, because now it can cross with the top part of the tree. So you can actually get a wild population and seeds from one tree if you're not careful. That's sort of one of
And
the
then 25 years ago, Arbor Day Society was sending out free trees, and along came Bradford pears. And so I planted them until now. They're big and beautiful, but they're starting to fall apart.
yeah.
You know, there's no central leader, like you said. And those big branches that were beautiful one day are on the ground the next. They're just essentially, but they're not really dying, but they're not pretty anymore.
And what I've noticed is these I'm maybe just they're not big enough yet. They seem to have stronger trunks than the ones you'd buy, because you see them windstorm come through or gust of wind, they just snap in people's yards. Like, I planted this tree 15 years ago, now it's broke over. What do I do with it? And it's like, these things won't die.
Yeah.
And it seems like the wild ones are even tougher.
That's what I mean. The wild ones are tough.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the wild ones are on their own roots too.
Mhm.
So I think that makes them tougher. And
Yeah.
they're in a way adapted. I mean, they've been there, they're growing.
Now, did you mention earlier not to burn them?
Oh, I know when if you're trying to get rid of them, so Great Parks over here in Hamilton County, they have shaker trace wetlands at one of their parks. And so the pears are popping up all in the wetlands. And so they do controlled burns there oftentimes just for the prairies. And so there's been a few studies where people have shown, not me, but others have shown that if you try to burn them, again, it just makes them mad, is what I call it. And so it doesn't kill them. They just start sprouting again. It will kill any seeds that are laying on the surface, but anything further down, and we've shown that seeds can live up to 11 years and probably longer in the soil. And so it won't kill them. So we recommend, or at least I recommend, fire, you got to be really careful, because of those of you who use prescribed fire, you have to be careful of the temperature too. And so that's not as effective, as we've seen with, unfortunately, you have to do the manual, just cut and spray is what we found more effective.
Has anybody done any drone spraying of them over in your all's area?
Not that I know of. Yeah.
Or forest mulching. I've seen that as an option too. People have looked at.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
But yeah.
Which I don't believe controlled burn is allowed in West Virginia. So anybody's thinking about that, make sure you check with Division of Forestry, I guess, your local fire department, make sure. But I'm pretty sure controlled burn is not approved practice in West Virginia.
Yeah, that's a good point. Whenever we do, well, I don't do prescribed burning, but you have to be licensed to do that. And you do need to work with your local fire department, obviously.
Yeah, Teresa, I was just looking at that article. Were we in trouble when the guy that worked for USDA, Frank Meyer, it says that he after he collected all these seeds, but then he died drowned in a river over in China and never made it back. Was that a bad sign?
That's a sort of it's a really sad story. So I'm also into history, and so there's a wonderful book about Frank. And you said Frank Meyer, Meyer, is the USDA plant inspector, not inspector, explorer. And he's responsible for a number of different species that were brought into the US from China. So the Meyer lemon
okay.
is also named after him.
Oh.
And so he brought over a whole bunch of fruit trees. It wasn't just like a year or two he worked for the USDA for a long time, and he was really dedicated to his job, and he left a whole bunch of writings and photographs. And so it's pretty apparent that he was very smart, but I think he was sort of like a loner in a way. And in his writings, you could tell that he didn't really want to come back to the US, but he was being called back. And then, so there's some discussion as to whether it was an accidental fall off the ship when he was coming back to the US on his final trip in China, or whether, he actually purposely
tried to swim long distance.
Yeah. So he was a very smart, intelligent man, but he I always think of as a tormented soul, perhaps.
Yeah, I seen that the guy that was in charge of the USDA back then was kind of that was our exploratory time where they were, like you said, they were not just China but other places too. They were bringing all these seeds back, kind of to see if they had agricultural.
That would have been the Multiple Rose era, probably the Autumn Olive era.
It was a little before
All of
that, I
that.
think.
Yeah. And the idea back then, yeah, again, we didn't know this was a problem, was that this is a way to actually enhance the United States agriculture. You know, we could bring in these really cool species from other areas of the world and grow them.
And
So,
with them came other insect pests and other diseases, probably, and all kinds of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
They just weren't aware of it, didn't think that was going to be an issue 50, 60
yeah.
years later. And even 30 years ago, people were planting these trees because they were told they were sterile. And
Yeah.
Well, Evan, that from the line from Jurassic Park, nature finds a way, and then from there on, now we have these calorie pears growing everywhere. Teresa,
I didn't have a Jurassic Park reference on my bingo card today, but I like it.
yeah, you have Jurassic Park line there. It's kind of amazing to me, Teresa. I was reading a fact sheet from the University of Wisconsin, south into I think Mississippi. So are these calorie pears basically all over the United States?
Yeah, exactly. They're pretty much all over. We've been watching Mike Vincent back in, gosh, 24, well, even before that, before the 2000s. He was doing a herbarium study. And so he was seeing, when they first started to appear in the herbarium records, which means that just someone was walking around and saw them and decided to grab them and record it. And so we know that they've been around for quite a long time. But they've just been, and that's one reason why I was interested in them is, we know they've been hanging out there, but then they suddenly exploded. So you were mentioning like this year especially, at least in southwestern Ohio. I don't know what it's like for you guys, but this was like the year for calorie pear. They were all over the place densely, because you could see them flowering. So it's a pretty big problem.
Yeah. Do you think it's going to get worse before it gets better?
Yeah, unfortunately, because now even if you drive around on areas of the hills and the roads where it wasn't a big, you couldn't see them. If you drive really slowly and you look, there's a whole bunch of seedlings just hanging out there. And they start blooming in about their third year. So they can actually start going pretty fast. And so I think it's just going to keep getting worse, honestly, unfortunately.
What are some successful programs you've seen that people implemented to try to take them back, to get rid of them, replace them with native plants or other plants?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's programs called bounty programs. And so there's a few. And the idea here is that if we offer an incentive to people to take down their calorie pears, then they might want to do that. And we know that once you remove the calorie pears, even one plant, if you take a tree out from your yard, that tree itself produces thousands of, probably millions, I'm going to say thousands of seeds. And so if you take out that tree, you can really make a dramatic impact right away. So the bounty programs, what they do is someone needs to show evidence that they've taken out their tree. Some people say a photograph, a branch, a cut piece of the main trunk, whatever. And you bring it to a location. And then in turn, usually you are given one tree, a native tree, to replace it. And some people pay money, but again, this costs money because they have to purchase those trees. So, for example, South Carolina ran a bounty program through Clemson University. And then I just found out a few days ago that here in Ohio, Licking County is offering a bounty program as well. And so owners, at least in the South Carolina one, you could bring evidence of at least 5 trees that you have removed on your property, and then they will replace it for you. Now, the replacement is probably going to be a small, sapling. It's not going to be something extravagant.
Right.
But
yeah, I was reading some of the trees of some of those programs. When you say bounty programs, I'm thinking like a bounty hunter or maybe an old Western picture, a Western poster that says wanted calorie pear, and then a reward for it. But I think the one I was looking at was in Missouri, but you could like send a picture if it was a bigger tree, send a picture that you evidence that you cut it down, and then you got a small, like you were saying, it's a small sapling.
Yeah, exactly. And I see there's a question about who does the bounty program. And so it depends upon the state. It depends upon who's offering it. Obviously, there has to be money behind it because you got to purchase the replacement trees. But in South Carolina, that was Clemson University, and I'm sure they got their money from somewhere else. But oftentimes, I mean, it could be a Department of Ag, DNR. It might be other entities because oftentimes, funding is tight all around. And so, yeah, offered by different people, but you can always ask too. That's important.
Yeah, I think that one in Missouri was the Department of Natural Resources, I think. But yeah, extension. Evan, weren't you talking about the one at Clemson? When did they do that? Just last year?
I didn't know Clemson was one of them until she mentioned it a few seconds ago. I think it was Virginia and maybe NC State or North Carolina was doing something similar. And I believe Ohio just restricted the sale of the plants, right?
Yeah, so Ohio, we actually because I was involved in that because I work also on the regulatory side. And so we were able to successfully ban the Callery pear. Initially, it was on our 2018 list of regulation, but it had a 5-year phase out period. So in January of 2023, it became illegal to sell or distribute Callery pear within or outside, from the state of Ohio. So we were the first state to do that, which we're sort of proud of. Let's see, South Carolina is the second, so that already kicked in. And then I found out that Pennsylvania sort of did it too because they consider Callery pear on their noxious list. And so that got that way. And then I recently found out Wisconsin has that also heading towards being regulated or already is.
Now, was there a public outcry wanting the Ohio legislature to put that in? Or how did that go about getting started?
Yeah,
Right now, our Department of Ag, they're like,
yeah,
it's got to go through our
yeah.
state legislature body to be added to it.
Yeah, so there's different ways to do regulation. So maybe what you're describing is more of a process where you have a bill that has to go through the state house and it lists everything. And anytime you add any new plants, it has to be added to the list and then it has to go back through the state house and get approved. And so that's really long and controversial. So the other way, which is what Ohio does, is we do it through a rulemaking process. So there was a law passed that allows the Ohio Department of Ag to actually make the list of invasive species that are banned, from commercial sale and production. And so rather than having that list go through the state legislature and be debated and everything, it just goes through our Ohio Department of Agriculture. And agriculture was selected because the agricultural inspectors are the ones who are already in the nurseries looking at the stock for pests and pathogens and so forth. So it made sense that they would be looking for invasives. And the way that came about is actually one of the other hats I wear is with the Ohio Invasive Plants Council. And so I lead the team that lists invasive plants for the state that are not regulated. It doesn't have any regulation attached. And we worked a lot at the time with the Ohio Nursery and Landscape Association, which is known now as the IGIA, or the OGIA rather than the ONLA. And interestingly, for years, we had not been suggesting anything about regulation because we knew it was so controversial. But the nursery industry came to the Ohio Invasive Plants Council and they said, hey, we see what's going on in other states like Connecticut, Massachusetts with barberry is one example where they were told, hey, you can't sell it. And the nursery industry in Ohio said, we want to be part of this conversation. So we actually worked with them to actually construct the law and to get that passed initially, that set up regulation that kicked in 2018. So that's a long way of saying, yes, the Callery pear is regulated in the state of Ohio. It was through a long process where we worked very carefully with the nursery industry because Ohio is actually one of the main producers and sellers of Callery pear along Lake Erie. And so we wanted to make sure that everyone had a voice, had a chance to be involved and understood the problem. And that's only how we were then able to move forward.
Yeah, Teresa, you find a funny story. I went only an ag agent. I went to Tractor Supply here in Marietta, and I was looking through some of the nursery stock, and they had a Cleveland Select for sale. So I walked in and I said, "Hey, it's illegal to sell that pear tree out there." I said, "You guys have to destroy it." So the guy argued with me and said that, if Tractor Supply had sent that, then I didn't know what I was talking about. But so there
Well,
are
that's
they
actually
still
a
allowed to
really good
sell them?
point. Yeah. I was going to say that's a good point because the big box stores, one thing I've learned, and this is a learning process for me, is that oftentimes they're just sent their stock from oftentimes out of state. And so there's a disconnect where there's a point where we have to go talk to them and be like, okay, look, you can't have that species anymore. But the manager might, I mean, he could have been telling you obviously the truth.
Well, I was telling Evan, and he's like, "Well, who did you call?" I said, "Well, I wasn't going to call the environmental police because I guess they're who was I going to call and tell them yeah, you can't sell that. You need to destroy that tree." Um,
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
kind of an issue.
Hey JJ,
Yes,
is the
Cody.
Cleveland is that on the noxious weed list here in West Virginia?
This was in Ohio.
Oh, in Ohio. Okay.
I I don't know. I guess I'll have to ask Norm Bailey with the Department of Ag or
I'm pulling it up to see there.
but it's something that we need to take a look at. Definitely. Teresa, let's switch gears here.
Sure.
Okay, we've got thousands, if not millions, of homeowners that have a pear in their yard. They take that out. What are their I've got a list here. We can go over some of I'll name some species and ask you how you think they would be for a um, replacement. What about a crabapple?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of people think crabapple because number one, it's sort of related to the pear, sort of in the same plant family. Crab apples have that not as great looking spring blooms, but it does have some blooms. What I would recommend is actually not crabapple, because we're starting to see, at least here in Ohio, we're starting to see crabapple popping up in natural areas. And so we don't know what's going on, but there's people now, primarily at Dawes Arboretum near Columbus, where they're starting to study that. So we're trying to explain. The concern is that this might be like the Callery pear 20, 25 years ago, just starting to appear.
Well, what about the research center they have up? Ohio State has that Seacrest Arboretum. There's
Yeah.
hundreds or not thousands, hundreds of varieties planted up there.
Yeah. And so that's one way where we can actually work with the Arboreta. So I have a different program. I work with public gardens and Arboreta across North America because, like you mentioned, they have oftentimes plants in their collection and they've been carefully monitoring them. They know what's there. They know when they were planted. They know oftentimes if it's been spreading. And so for me, the Arboreta in the gardens that plant those crab apples or anything that's of concern, that's actually a really good resource because if it's going to spread, it would probably do it initially within that garden. And so if they're not seeing any spread, I've never talked to them, but if they're not seeing spread, and that would allay, I guess, some of my initial concerns about that one.
What about for our native planters out there, our native serviceberry? Is that a
Yeah,
good choice?
Yeah, I like serviceberry. And again, it depends on what like a homeowner is going for. So if they're going for the spring flowers, that's one thing. If they're more so going for the form of the tree, that's another thing. Or some people want the fall color. So that works. I personally, in my yard, all my neighbors had Callery pears and now they're all dying. And just self-destructing because they're old. I actually have a yellowwood in my yard and I love the yellowwood. It's a gorgeous tree. It's native. The problem, well, not the problem for me. It produces flowers maybe every few years. It just these profuse pendulent flowers, hanging downwards, but it's not every year like you see with the Callery pear.
Oh, okay. Well, before I get to the next one,
Yeah.
how do you? Because it sounds like you're working some with the nursery industry. how do we ramp up production of some of these other alternatives with the nursery growers
Yeah.
to plant and sell more of those?
Yeah, so they're already working on that,
Okay.
because that's one of the points of working with the nursery industry is to give them a heads up, like, hey, this plant over here is looking like it's starting to spread. You might want to be thinking a little bit more, you know, in the future about coming up with an alternative. Because one thing I learned from the nursery industry going into this, not knowing anything, is that it's hard for them just to like suddenly stop selling a plant because they've been building years and years into
They've got an
production.
assembly line, don't they?
Yeah. And so thinking like emerald ash borer, you know, came into Ohio. Millions and millions of dollars were lost in nursery stock, you know, and I wouldn't want that on anyone.
Yeah. So what, like the, for example, the Callery Pear, say now Cleveland Select or whatever. You've got all these trees that are 2 or 3 years old, and Ohio passes this law. You can't sell those. What did they do with those? Do they have to destroy all of them? Throw them in the
Yeah, so
compost pile?
essentially, yeah, they can't sell them. Now keep in mind they've known about this for 5 years.
Okay.
So that's the whole reason of the phase out period, is that it allows the nurseries to actually ramp down.
Right.
And what it also means, I mean, we also joke, you know, it's a fire sale because then they could sell a whole bunch. So sometimes you might see those. But yeah, that's what it allows them to do. So if they were paying attention, they should know that that was happening.
I'll go to my next one here. We had a Master Gardener Spring Seminar here, so I kind of made a little presentation with a list of some replacements. What about
Yeah.
the Eastern Redbud?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I should have said that's my favorite one. I have the
All right.
yellowwood. I love redbud. So for those of you, if you don't know Eastern Redbud, it's the one usually has pink flowers. There's other varieties. I have like an Allegheny redbud.
Are there ones developed that have white blooms instead of the pink? Are they
Yeah,
all?
I've seen some white ones. I do not
Oh.
have the white ones. I'm more natural, so I have
Okay.
the pinks. I have several around my yard. Some are cultivars, and some honestly just popped up in my yard, probably from a neighbor's redbud.
Okay.
And they're really nice. I really like them. It's a smaller tree, so it's never, if someone has a pear tree that's like a you know, some of the Chanticleers and some of the like White House will get really tall and Pencil Lake skinny. It's never going to do that. So it's more of a smaller tree, but it more graceful, I would say. And it has those heart-shaped leaves.
Yeah, and they're you can see those in the spring when you're taking a drive Route 50 here, and I drive a lot of times to Clarksburg, and you'll see the gorgeous blooms there in the spring. One I thought was kind of interesting is American plum. Is that not to be confused with some of the plums that are in for fruit production?
Yeah, so you have to make sure you have the right one. But that one would work. That one, at least in Ohio, I'm not aware of it being so popular in terms of production. But it could be one that could be ramped up. The other thing that's sort of interesting is that there's also now sterile, putatively sterile, I'm using air quotes, sterile Callery pear. And these are triploids. And this one, it's a new cultivar. It's been out maybe for 2 years. It comes from NC State, and it's called Chastity, which cracks me up. But the idea is that because it's triploid, it is mainly seed sterile. And if I remember the stats correctly, it's like 98% seed sterile. But what I want to know is whether it's pollen sterile. Because if someone plants a seed sterile variety, but yet the pollen could still get out to my neighbor's Bradford tree, then we still have a problem.
Yeah, and I know it's always been a popular one, flowering dogwood. And of course, that might bring up the debate between the flowering or I think it's the Japanese dogwoods. What's your opinion on some of those for ornamentals?
Yeah. So I just bought a dogwood that I'm trying to get into my yard because I have a spice bush that I trained into a tree, and then it suddenly died. So I'm in the process of digging out my very big spice bush tree to plant the dogwood. Dogwoods are good, except you need to plant it in the right area. in the right soil. So oftentimes people the nice thing about the Callery pear is it can grow anywhere, and the joke is you just cut the stem and you pluck it into the ground and it will grow. Dogwoods and many of our natives, it's like any plant. It's a little bit more picky, and you got to be really careful where you put it in terms of shade, water.
Yeah, they're kind of an
soil.
understory, so kind of on the edge.
Exactly.
I've got 3 right in my yard. Like they're out in the full sun, and
cool.
they're rocking and rolling.
Yeah, that's good.
I'm looking at my list here. This was kind of an interesting one. I had worked with another agent on some of these. This American hawthorn bean, kind of a little bit bigger tree. Are you familiar with that? Would that be a replacement, or is it a little bit too big?
It's going to be bigger, so it depends on, again, where people want it. If you're looking like a little tiny tree next to your house or in a corner of a foundational planting, you're probably not going to want it there. If you have it further away, then you could do it there. Yeah.
Or I was on a farm visit and someone had told me about their ironwood tree. So that's kind of one of the other names for it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's native in the forest. So oftentimes, like we see it in southern Ohio, sort of solitary. It has really nice trunk. I always like that trunk of that tree. But yeah, it's going to be sort of similar to dogwood in terms of where it naturally grows, but it can definitely grow out, in full sun.
I guess the blooms aren't as showy. It was
no, so that's going to be primarily made more so for the form and the vegetation.
Okay.
So and that's what I was saying like earlier, like if someone really wants that bloom, then that's where you're going to go more red bud, yellowwood, those types of trees. But if you're just looking for the form, you don't care so much about the blooms, then there's, other possibilities that you might choose.
We do have a question from Lisa. She said, are there any sunset rules to help with the changes?
Sunset rules in the sense that there's
Lisa,
acceptance.
You want to unmute yourself and ask? She's still here? Lisa?
She might not be able to unmute. Who knows?
Yeah. So what she might be thinking, that's when I had mentioned we have what we call the phase out period.
Mm-hmm.
So we know, we could say in terms of the regulation that a plant is going to be regulated and banned from commercial sale and production, but we don't say, hey, it's just going to happen in 2 months. So we're given with the Callery pear originally, we had a big conversation about this. They one person said 10 years and I wanted 1 year. And then eventually we settled on 5.
That's quite a long phase out period there.
Yeah.
Man.
Theresa, the city of Parkersburg or Vienna, I think, I'll have to check. They planted just last year some American hawthorn. Is that a pretty good substitute?
Yeah, that could work. I think that's a good one. And then you reminded me, another one is Fringe tree.
Okay.
And Fringe tree is one that we initially recommended.
That one.
Yeah, and then we were pulling back on it because there were some preliminary reports that it was being attacked by the emerald ash borer.
Oh God.
So it turns out it's it's related to the ash.
It's in the olive family?
I think so. I need to look it up.
American fringe tree.
Yeah. And it has those flowers. I mean, it sort of reminds me a little bit more of the yellowwood. But fringe tree, I was talking to Joe Boggs. Remember, we were just and Joe is telling me that he's been checking some of those trees that were attacked by emerald ash borer, and they're not being killed by emerald ash borer like ash normally is. So it's coming back on my list of it might be a good replacement tree.
Now, one that I'm not familiar with, and maybe you could help us out, this Carolina silver bell, says that it's native from West Virginia to Florida.
Yeah, that one I don't have a lot of experience with. You're right that it is native. I personally have not seen that very much available in local nurseries. And so that might be more of a specialty tree.
Yeah, that's something that Now, are you on a board that kind of makes recommendations to some of these nurseries that grow all these plants?
No, actually, we just work with them on invasive,
Oh,
plants,
okay,
but
just invasive.
not. Yeah, for me, it's mainly talking. I work a lot with the nursery industry, um, because it's I can learn a lot from them, and so we're also trying to let them know when there's a plant that's starting to sprout up, or we're suddenly getting a whole bunch of reports from across the state of this thing spreading. And so usually I can give them a heads up that, hey, I don't know what's going to happen yet with this, but we're getting a bunch of reports that something's happening. So I think
You know,
that's,
you had mentioned those invasives. Of course, my brother had come to one of our master gardener. We have like a plant sale, and I think they were selling the burning bush plants. Someone had some starts. And of course, my
yeah,
brother was like, "Well, those are illegal. Those are invasive. I don't know if it's illegal in West Virginia, but it's illegal in Ohio, right? Or invasive, considered
it's
invasive."
actually, yeah. So burning bush is considered invasive in Ohio, according to the Ohio Invasive Plants Council. It is not illegal. So it is not on the ODA regulatory list. So in Ohio, we have two lists, essentially. You have the regulatory list, and then you have what I call an educational list. So according to the science, are these things considered invasive or not? And so burning bush is on that. We are actually studying burning bush in my lab, because again,
Cool.
why the heck would a plant that people have planted all over the place suddenly start to appear and spread into natural forests? And we are seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, forsythia will spread too, but is that on your list?
So forsythia is one of these that, especially this spring, I've been getting a lot of calls about. And so it is on my list to assess, to look at
Yeah.
with my team. But I think it's one of those where it's doing something different it didn't do before. And so whether that rises to the level of invasiveness, I don't know yet.
And I mean, it doesn't spread that fast either. And two, I think part of it is in some yards, homeowners a lack of maintenance because they
Yeah.
let these forsythias get out of control and it like turns into a hedge. So it's
Yeah.
a big
Yeah.
yellow hedge there in March.
And they're beautiful. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about it, those yellow flowers, they're
And
gorgeous.
they do help hold creek banks in. We have a guy out there, he went and killed his out, and his creek started slipping afterward. I'm like, yeah,
Oh,
that's you kill the roots, take out the support, it's going to slip away on you.
Evan, any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, we have a couple here.
Okay.
Okay, let me go back up here.
yeah.
Lisa said that they have burning bushes. Someone planted them because they were pretty. We try to cut them down, but they have started regrowing already. And what about mimosa trees? Are those illegal versus invasive?
Yeah. So let me take the second question. So the mimosa tree, and I need to figure out, some people are saying that they know that one. Those are not, so that's one we have not assessed yet in Ohio because it is not a problem in Ohio. However, sometimes I drive down to Florida, and as you go south, you can see more and more of them, and they're crazy. So I would say in Florida and more towards the south, it is considered to be invasive. I would have to look to see if it's illegal. Probably not, because a lot of the southern states don't necessarily have, regulations yet. And then Jody's saying they were a problem in North Carolina. I believe that one.
Okay.
The burning bushes, getting back to that, it's sort of like the Callery pear, where I think if you cut them, you probably have to treat the stump because they're going to sprout from the stump. And then on a related note, we talked about, so burning bush is Euonymus elatus. Another related species is Euonymus fortunii, which is winter creeper, and that's a vine. And winter creeper, we actually did a whole project in my lab using genetics, DNA markers, which is fun. And it's all a puzzle. And what we found out is we sampled winter creeper across the country from multiple states, and it is all one single genotype, one cultivar, and that is coloratus. So winter creeper is a bunch of cultivars, and it's actually one cultivar that has gotten out and gone crazy. I always thought that was interesting.
Have you done any work with multiflora rose? Is it all one cultivar?
We haven't done multiflora rose. Oh gosh, I don't know. It's probably a combination, maybe. It's
Yeah,
the
and
original
actually,
rootstock that they use.
Evan had mentioned that because I think somewhere in my office I still have the pamphlets. One of those USDA pamphlets they sent out because they were recommending it for a living fence
Yeah.
in the
Yep.
30s or 40s. It was
Yeah.
kind of crazy, but yeah, that experiment did not work out well, did it, Evan?
That's along with other plants that, that goes back to oftentimes we did things in the past and we thought it was the most brilliant idea at the time, and now we know better.
Definitely. Well, we're going to run out of time, Theresa, but this has been really informative and fun, learning more about the calorie pear and any last, I guess, summation or some
Yeah.
advice to some of our homeowners what they've got the one of these varieties of calorie pear in their yard.
Yeah. So I would say two things. One, if they have a calorie pear, I would definitely encourage them to consider replacing it, because it's just going to keep seeding. And some people, when they talk about seeds or fruits, they're thinking big pear fruits. And no, this species is a little tiny marble size. That's the fruit. And it has anywhere from 4 to 10 seeds per fruit. So those can get out. The last thing I want to leave you with is, like, we've been talking about a bunch of different species, calorie pear being one, and burning bush and all these others. And I've been mentioning that they're from Asia. And it turns out there's a reason for that. If you look at a lot of invasive species here in the US, they actually do originate from Asia. So if you look on a globe, we're in the northern hemisphere on this side of the globe, and Asia and China are over here. Japan, Taiwan, they're over here on this side of the globe. So what that means is any plant that's adapted to areas of China, like the calorie pear, if you move them over to North America at the same latitude, which is where we're at, they do really well. And then the other question I get from people is, okay, did you get the reverse? Do our species actually become invasive in China and other places there? And the answer is actually yes. So some of our things like maples and so forth have become a problem in China.
Huh.
Wow.
Interesting. Yes, and again, we want to thank our special guest for today for Mountaineer Farm Talk, Dr. Theresa Culley. She's a plant biologist there at the University of Cincinnati. Now, Theresa, before I let you go, I always ask everyone this question. My dad said that there was two types of music, country and Western. So I need to know who your favorite country music artist is.
Oh gosh, that's a good one. I really want to say Beyonce, but that, to me, I'm gonna go classic.
Yeah.
So I was raised on Dolly Parton and Willie Nelson, so that
Okay.
might date me. But I'm going in Crystal Gale, perhaps. I'm going with them.
Yeah, you said you talk about Crystal Gale. I always want to get one of those from the Ricky Bobby movie where it's got he's got the Crystal Gale T-shirt. He says he says like, "How was your day?" And he's like, "Well, I got my Crystal Gale T-shirt got ruined, Mom."
Aw.
Crystal Gale, Dolly Parton, and Willie Nelson. That's pretty good. Those are old school.
JJ, we do have a
Like
couple questions here that's popped in the chat.
Another question? Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What about Princess Tree?
Yeah, Princess Tree is probably a bigger problem in your guys' area, I would assume. We have it here in Southern Ohio. We get rid of it as soon as we can find it. That thing is crazy. You gotta admire the tree. It produces millions of seeds per year. They're wind dispersed, which is worrisome. And in the Appalachians, it's all over. If you go down the Smokies, it's a big problem. And so they're going to displace other species. They're beautiful. They also were sold by the Arbor Day years ago and given away. People would plant them in their yards because they are reported to grow at least 12 feet a year. I don't know how true that is, but they're a fast grower.
Holy moly.
And if you cut them, like we cut them in the preserve I have, they're, a 6-year-old one, its girth, I don't know, could be bigger, bigger than a big thigh, I guess. But yeah. And it's like balsa wood, if you've ever cut them.
And Lisa Jones, Small Farm Center, she said she knows some scientists. They're in Morgantown. When they traveled abroad, they brought they planted their yards full of Japanese plants, and she saw the princess trees in New River Gorge, which is now a federal national park.
Yep.
And Jody Carpenter saw them along 64 to 79 the other day when they were coming back from kicking butt out there judging soil.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Way to go. All right. Well, we thank everyone for joining us for this edition of Mountaineer Farm Talk. Again, thank our special guest, Dr. Theresa Culley. And we'll see everyone next week. Enjoy your weekend. Take care.